There's been plenty of talk for nearly 80 years, and the last decade in particular, about London and North Eastern Railway Chief Mechanical Engineer Edward Thompson. As successor to the much acclaimed and celebrated Sir Nigel Gresley, Thompson came in at an undoubtedly difficult time and was charged with implementing some controversial regime changes. While trying his own hand at locomotive and rolling stock development, his efforts never reached the same level of praise and historic judgment as those of his predecessor. A lot of what's been said about his work has gone down in history as being anti-Gresley, dreadfully engineered, ugly, and could only be corrected by his follow-up, Arthur Peppercorn. Though in recent years there's been some notable discourse over whether or not all of Thompson's criticism was fully justified. Having made a name for himself writing the British Railway series on YouTube and later in book form, Simon A.C. Martin has spent more than a decade gathering findings of Thompson's activities and finally compiled them into this 184-page magnum opus. His introduction boldly stating, "If in publishing this book and putting out more explicitly the timeline around which Edward Thompson's regime as CME of the LNER happened, can allow a better understanding of the enormous difficulties he, his loyal and hard-working staff on the LNER and the wider railway faced during the Second World War, then I will have done my job." And it can't be denied that he certainly put things into perspective. The book goes out of its way to quote the secondary findings of railway historians like O.S. Nock, along with quoting articles from periodic issues of the Railway magazine before comparing them to primary records of the era held in the LNER's archives at Kew Gardens. Letters, meeting minutes, and a previously edited engineering report on the reliability of Gresley's conjugated valve gear written by E.S. Cox and signed off by William Stanier help the reader to understand that while sometimes visually subjective and bereft of historic value, the decisions made during the Thompson era were made more out of desperate economic necessity than any personal vendetta. One of the most frequently used words in this book is availability, referring to the annual mileage undertaken by locomotive classes considered fit for traffic against the amount of time they spent under general repair. And in light of the Cox and Stanier report, the subsequent figures emphasise that while Gresley's conjugated gear was clever, it was more prone to failure when the LNER's workforce and workshop facilities were rationalised in World War II. Context has often been overlooked when it comes to the reasoning behind rebuilding locomotives, and while the formula behind the percentages isn't always made very clear, the results make for some interesting revelations. Learning, for instance, that former P2 Thane of Fife managed over 45,000 miles in her first year in traffic as a rebuilt Thompson A2 Pacific, with little to no tweaks required, more than 20,000 above the P2's entire yearly average, proved a welcome tribute to the resource employed by Doncaster's remaining workforce during such difficult times, especially when compared to Thompson's wartime contemporary Oliver Bulleid over on the Southern, who had to extensively modify his first Merchant Navy Pacifics upon entry into service. A comprehensive explanation behind each locomotive class rebuilt during this time is complemented with detailed figures and tables showing the scale of the LNER's locomotive fleet year after year. These are further enhanced by vivid photographs from the LNER Society and numerous other archives. Many boast an excellent colorizing by Ian McCabe. In a similar format to Martin's BRWS books, the final third is devoted to reference points and technical statistics gathered from remaining records. The only criticism may be the possibility of being blinded by the sheer number of graphs and tables laid out before the reader, but that equally demonstrates the sheer depth of analysis Martin has gone to with his findings. There's some interesting personable touches in the book as well. Those who know Martin will be familiar with his other passing interests and influences. See if you can spot the, perhaps unintended, nod to Leonard Nimoy in Star Trek somewhere in the first quarter of the book. Albeit those who may not have a taste for the Merchant Navy Locomotive Preservation Society may have to turn a blind eye to the MNLPS's treasurer downright declaring his bias later on. No doubt there's great passion smouldering over the choice of Pioneer Gresley Pacific Great Northern for rebuilding into Thompson's new A1 Pacific with the same name. People normally use Thompson as the scapegoat in this scenario, thinking that the role of Chief Mechanical Engineer was the be-all and end-all, and therefore he had final say in everything that was signed off, when the book explains a very different story involving Locomotive Superintendent G.A. Musgrave, the LNER Emergency Board, and by some extension the War Office, putting to bed the fact that it was more Thompson's job to go through the design details than it was to choose and sign off a specific candidate. All this, keep in mind, at a time when the railway's resources were still under heavy strain and preserving historic locomotives wasn't exactly a top LNER priority to begin with. The harsh reality is, even with primary sourced evidence in his favour, Martin's book will likely not change absolutely everybody's minds regarding Thompson. We live in a world where there's so much information out there that anybody can express their opinion and come to their own conclusions and simply won't be convinced otherwise, for better or worse. But when it comes to getting people to discuss, re-evaluate and analyse what is perhaps a lesser known period of London and North Eastern Railway history using records of the day as opposed to 10th-hand insults, Edward Thompson, Wartime CME, will more than likely do the job. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you liked what you hear and you'd like to see more on the channel, then feel free to like, share, subscribe, discuss, contribute to my Patreon, and check out my range of merchandise at www.egmedia.co.uk/shop. See you next time.